Good afternoon, everybody. We are very happy that you stay with us for the last panel session of this one-day conference. My name is Alice Kubova, and I have the honor to moderate this discussion. The title of this panel is Are National Cultural Institutions Losing Their Legitimacy? And we would love to focus our discussion very much to the topics, so the quest for legitimacy in national cultural institutions. To do so, I would like to present our speakers very briefly. I go from my left. I introduce you Marta Ljubkova, who is the program editor and the dramaturg of the drama department in National Theatre in Prague, and who is a lecturer at the Academy of Performing Arts too. Then we have Julia Popovic, who is a journalist, performing arts critic and curator, and also previous counselor of the National Theatre in Bucharest and the previous counselor of the Minister of Culture in Bucharest. And finally, I'm happy to invite here Dieter Haselbach, who is professor of sociology at the Philipps Universität Marburg and the director and managing director of the Center for Cultural Research. So just to start our speech, not to finish, I would love also to invite you to the discussion. So just to mention, we are all aware that you are here and that we are very much eager to listen your responses also during the panel session. So whenever you have impression that you have something to add, to ask, to disagree or to agree, we will be happy to give you the voice. The panel session is entitled Are National Cultural Institutions Losing Their Legitimacy? Which kind of implicitly suggests that the national cultural institutions do lose their legitimacy, or at least there is something like need for transformation of this legitimacy, to say why we are here, on the basis of what values and face-to-face to what requirements we exist. So my first question to the panelists is, do you agree with this opinion? Is there some kind of crisis or need for transformation of legitimacy, or even a lack of legitimacy of national cultural institutions? You look at me, so you...
Well, thank you very much. I think I take the first chance in a very well gendered panel here. I love that very much. And before answering the question, I want to make two remarks. The one remark, we are coming together here as, or this is the official part, I have to say, of the assembly of compendium experts. And I think it's just time to publicly state that the fact that we are together here is to a great extent in the responsibility, and we have to be thankful for that, to get all these wonderful people together, of Andreas Wiesand, who has founded the compendium many years ago and has taken a great effort of getting all these people together every year, of course, with the help and funding of public institutions and so on. But I think there should be a great thank you to Andreas Wiesand that he makes this possible, and that he is masterminding these kinds of assemblies. And I think we should really recognize him and thank him for that. Second remark I want to make before is just to get you out of, I don't know a good translation, but I try my English, out of the coma coming from soup or some other things to eat. And this is, I had the feeling this morning that Professor Gielen and I are living in different worlds. And for some reason, I doubt it or allow myself to say here, I don't know whether the wisdom was that great to invite someone who is himself giving a populist position while we are discussing populism in cultural policy. The populism is, just in 3 sentences, very short, we are the people, the framing of the civil society. The state is the enemy, the government, this, I think you all remember the phrases, and resistance is the correct mode to be in for cultural people. I think we are not in this crisis, and I think this is a left-leaning populist discussion or position, and maybe we could discuss this at some point. Now I come to the question of national institutions and the legitimacy of thereof. And I have to say, well, I'm a researcher and planner, and so I have a professional deformation of talking in empiricist and economic terms. I don't see that national institutions are falling out of funding. And for that reason, the legitimacy of funding is still there. But then, of course, funding is both, and I think we should frame it in this way, it is both an asset and a liability. Because funding, public funding, state money, gives means for operating these national institutions, whatever they are, but it also means that someone else is having a say in what these institutions do. And this is a danger, of course, if there are cleavages between what these institutions want and what the fund givers want and so on. So it is a real difficulty. Another thing I just want to mention, since I talk about funding and not about legitimacy at this moment, or see legitimacy in the funding, I would say that there is a natural opposition that doesn't appear very often between the funded and the unfunded culture in a certain country. And there should be, and there is always, a political debate on those who don't get the funding, and of course their view on legitimacy is somewhat different to the others. And to make just another point in brief, I want to have a stark theoretical hypothesis, which I think I can substantiate but not prove, and this is that both institutional and artistic innovation normally doesn't come from the funded institutions, but from the outside, from the outskirts of the cultural field and so on. And to substantiate this, I just want to point your attention to one thing, and this is, once an institution gets funding, what is their first rationale? I tell you, it's to secure funding. So it's better you do the same as you have done and what you get the funding for. And innovation, of course, either to get into this or to do something new or whatever, doesn't come from where this institutional conservatism prevails. I think I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you very much. So you connected the question of legitimacy with founding questions and security, innovation. Do you have other opinions about the topic?
Well, it's interesting that we finally arrived to the hot topic. Legitimacy is where the money is. Well, I have, let's say, 3 examples to get into the concrete, because I think the other question that lies behind the title is actually, if we assume that the national institutions are losing their legitimacy, we assume that they had it in the first place, and we should question how they got it in the first place. Is it state funding or state support, or the state founding an institution what gives an automatic legitimacy to that institution? So let's go back to my three examples that also cover the creativity comes from outside the institution thing. In 2005, the Romanian state decided to invent a national institution called and widely known now as the Romanian Culture Institute. There was no public debate on what's the vision of this institution. We are, yes, copying the French, German, and Polish model, but why do you do it? Why do we do it? What's the image, the Romanian culture, or the culture of Romania, because Romania is a multinational country, but nobody questions the relationship between Romanian culture and the culture from Romania. There was no such debate. For 5 years, for 7 years, the institution was really thriving. It was led by a very charismatic person who had no previous experience in management or culture, but he was a very acute intellectual from the right anti-communist part, which was actually the dominating kind of intellectual culture in Romania at the time. And everybody was very happy. How the institution was working was not something to be questioned. In 2012, so 7 years after, when the government changed dramatically, and the party in parliament got, the main party in parliament got an overwhelming majority, this party changed the law. They kicked out the president of the Romanian Culture Institute. They named somebody else, and in 6 months, that institution didn't exist as an institution anymore. Nothing, except for the president and the two vice presidents of the institution, nothing else was changed. But in 6 months, nothing was working anymore. So the question is, was that an institution from the very beginning? Or was it a construction of a certain charismatic personality that couldn't exist and function without that personality running it? The second example is goes back to creativity and it connects somehow Romania and Poland. Poland didn't have, or hasn't had until this year, an independent sector in performing arts in the way that it is seen in Hungary or in Romania or in Germany. They didn't have a kind of performing arts scene for experiment, for political art, for contestation. Everything, all this happened within public institutions. Because that was the policy and the politics of the Polish state until the Law and Order Party got into power. To just offer this kind of support, the inclusion within the public institutions, public performing arts institutions, of all alternative discourse. When the politics of the state changed, this kind of alternative discourse that was hosted within public institutions was the first one to disappear. And this way, because there was no alternative, the artists didn't have any tools of surviving outside this system, all discursive opposition in terms of performing arts disappeared in a matter of a year. In the same time, in the same year of grace, 2005, the Romanian state invented yet another institution called the National Dance Center, which at the time and for the time being is the only institution designed to dedicated to producing and promoting contemporary dance. Actually, it wasn't like the fruit of a public policy. It was the result of a pressure that the community of artists put on the state. because they weren't so convinced that they could be very creative and exist outside of any institution, because there was nothing, nobody was dealing with contemporary dance in Romania by the time. For a while, that institution was a national institution, so it was national. It's called the National Dance Center. It's funded by the Ministry of Culture. It's as national as it gets. Was actually working as just like an independent organization. Then this is also something that was reproached to it. So, because it was invented from scratch by the artists, and it was designed according to their needs. And in the same time, they actually co-contributed to designing a public policy, or cultural policy on dance, because it didn't exist. So the state actually invented the National Dance Center somehow because it was way before the crisis. Romania was doing economically very well, and these artists were some troublemakers that were putting pressure with the help of the international dance community towards the state. It worked like, the National Dance Center worked like a community of artists running their own activity according to, of course, this public policy that they himself designed together with the Ministry of Culture for a while. But at some point, they said that they weren't institutional enough. So the whole system of running the National Dance Centers changed, but it still doesn't work. We are not talking about it still doesn't work. Now it doesn't work because it cannot foster the kind of creativity that it hosted before, and that creativity was what was making this institution work. In the moment when you ask a national institution dedicated to contemporary dance to act conservatively, this is a contradiction in terms. This is again against the original founding principle of the institution, and it is also against the principle of the art that particular institution is supposed to express. And this is the point where the National Dance Center is at this moment. It tries to become an institution. So, a national institution, to have procedures, to have staff that is dedicated for certain very specific activities, to plan activities well in advance, to program the space, to become as well organized, as procedural, and as conservative as an institution is supposed to be. Somehow, first, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it doesn't work for the artists that are supposed to work with that institution. And it doesn't work within the general field because actually the legitimacy of the National Dance Center and of contemporary dance relied not on the funding of the Ministry of Culture and not on the National Center being a national institution, but it relied on the artists themselves. When the artists quit the center, this legitimacy couldn't be, and it still cannot be, replaced by a title or by the origin of the funds.
Thank you very much. I don't want to be reductive or too superficial, but let's say we have now here a dichotomy between some kind of charisma and legitimacy stemming out of the artists versus self-proclamation or being given label that is not working according to you? Could you say it? I know that it's reductive, but could we have something just to memorize?
I think being an institution is something very delicate. Building an institution is something very delicate that has to take into consideration the specifics of the context, artistic and local context where it works. Because it's not enough for the state to proclaim and to fund an institution for it to actually be legitimate within that context and within the artistic field that it represents.
One more question. What is this subtle thing that should be maintained or even flourished, nourished through maybe the cooperation between artists and their surroundings, audience and state? What do you think is keeping the institution alive or even developing?
I think, at least in my part of Europe, these national institutions were invented to just proclaim the state. For instance, the first national institutions in Romania appeared for something called the process of Romanization. So they were meant actually to support the state itself. But this is very reductive, and it cannot work like that anymore. And it stopped working like that, I think, a long time ago. An institution has to negotiate between these two communities. The audience it addresses, which can be the national audience at large, and it needs a social agreement on the need and the function of that institution, and on the artistic community with which the institution works. Because for the time, there is this huge risk, at least in Eastern Europe, where the institutions tend to be more fragile, for them to be extremely self-serving. Outside this, the larger or smaller community that they're supposed to serve, usually the larger community, and especially towards the smaller community with which the institution is working.
Okay. Can I ask
I think
Marta?
first of all, I would like to emphasize that the position of performing arts institution is different than being a national institution or as a museum or gallery or something like that, because you deal with completely different material. As like archive, library, for instance, you preserve things and you keep the history, while National Theatre or any other institution which deals with performing arts, deal with living art, which is creating right now and dies out after, I don't know, 2-3 years. So this is why I think we have to ask this question whether it's legitimate or not, because these institutions, or the Institute of the National Theatre, was founded 150 years ago, exactly in this country next year, and the demands and the needs of that time are completely different than now. But still, we keep the label, and we have to ask what's covered, or what is this label for, or how we should fulfill the label or the message which is hidden under title national. And this is something what actually I don't know, because when I was trying to find a synonym of the National Theatre, I wrote down yesterday or 2 days ago, big, rich, most closely observed, and not very flexible, which is sometimes a burden when you have to do a living art. But still, I think as the richest theater institution in this country, we have some message we have to fulfill, or some task which we should fulfill, and this is something what I think switches the position of the national institution, because it's not just producing the art, but doing other activities besides, and trying to open the specific arts towards the biggest audience, as big as possible, and addressing minorities, but not only minorities, but minorities and majorities as well, or majority as well. So for me, we have to redefine our position and find new ways how to find the audience and how to develop the audience as well. And I would like to react to this founded and funded and unfunded and productive and progressive versus conservative. I think this is very reductive way how you look at the arts, and for me, as a person who works in the national institution, I think it's our aim or our task to open the space, because we are so rich, relatively rich, to open the space to as many artists as possible, to open it to students, for instance, and try to give the field to those who might not be able to find the money to do their arts otherwise. So I highly believe that the national institution should be the place, in ideal world, and since I work there, I'm an idealist, create a space for people to do new progressive things, which maybe we might talk later about the audience.
But is this a mission that is somehow newly established? Is there some inner debate about the change of this mission, or why are we asking about the legitimacy? Is it like this, that the national theatre or national institutions were legitimate before, but they are now into some kind of new requirements, like you mentioned, to open the space to students, to the minorities, but also to the broad audience in the state? Is this something that changes really, and why do you think is that the case?
I think it does, because the theater went through dramatic development in 90s, and the question of the theater in 90s were completely different than they are now. And since we are facing the political situation we are actually facing, we have to ask this question, and we started not inner discussion, not only inner discussion, but the discussion with the public. We had the first public debate, what is the national good for, or should we have the national theatre? And this is something I would like to continue with, because if we take these things for granted and don't ask them, we will not find a way out, or we will not find new ways which we should try, at least, if not follow, try in our firstly artistic way, but at the same time educational, etc. But definitely I think the question are on the, because these questions exist in the society, because everybody now after our elections, everybody is asking, what does this nation mean, what's xenophobia, etc. And having this label in the name, we are the first who should ask these questions.
So it seems that we have a very nice diversity of opinions. There is a, if I don't want to disinterpret you, but we maybe are seeing a variety between trust in the state and some kind of distrust in state proclamations, and a way of complex negotiation in between. Do you find some links? Do you want to add something in order to fill this field of opinions and react on your colleagues?
I would rather want to open it further, because that might make the discussion on the floor more lively. The question that came to my mind was in terms of this in-between situation. Okay, an institution doesn't function if there are no artists make it function and so on. Still, there is a question: who is giving the public mandate for spending public money, and I still insist on the public money issue. Is it the artists who are given themselves the mandates, or is it the arts institutions who are giving themselves the mandate? Then of course we have the question, which artists and which institutions, because there are always ins and outs. It's impossible to fund everything that wishes to be funded by the state. And I think this is true in all countries. So this in and out question needs to be addressed. A second thing, again, not to make peace on the podium, but to deepen the cleavage. I think it's a wonderful idea to have well-funded and rich institutions, and they open up to others and to artists. Again, the question is, to whom do they open up? And why do they open up? With which mandate? And to put this question more radical, why wouldn't arts funding be for open spaces rather than for institutions? I think it would be much more interesting to have open spaces where institutions or whatever, whoever wants to make art would find an opportunity to use this as a space to perform their art. So, which would mean to take the state out of the definition of what is the mandate and find ways to have societies discuss on what the mandate is. But as soon as there is public funding in the arts, I think we have to address that there will be politics in, and we also have to address that it is not possible to make peace by giving more money, because more money, a finding that is known in the arts economy literature, more funding addresses more people to get into the lottery to get even more funding and so on. So it's an insatiable scene, so to speak.
Well, I think we are in a sort of misunderstanding, at least in my country, but I think it's the same in the Czech Republic. We are not talking here about opposition between public money and private money. So the non-institutional art is also funded through public money, but not through subsidy, but through grants that are given based on call of application. So we are also dealing with public money, but the rationale and the access to resources between the two scenes is very unbalanced. So this question of mandate and so on, and when it's
in what way unbalanced towards?
Well, as I was telling you in the break, the National Theatre in Bucharest has a subsidy, so not the budget, the subsidy, an annual subsidy, twice the grant money given to all the projects in all fields, in all country by the National Endowment for the Arts. So the National Theatre in Bucharest, which only serves the audience in Bucharest and only develops programs in Bucharest, has 6 million euro subsidy, and the National Endowment for the Arts gives 3 million euros per year for everything. So this is this is the kind of unbalance where the public mandate and the mission and so on has to be questioned. So this is just because I was under the impression that we are suddenly having a discussion between the freedom of private money and the mandate attached to public money. It's at least in my context, we are talking basically about different forms of supporting art with private money.
Short intervention. Just very short, I did not talk at all about private money. And I don't see that there is in private funding, if it's funding, there is even more freedom.
Are there some immediate comments on this issue? Great, this is excellent. I just would love to see, just to have an overview. Could you somehow give a sign as who thinks that the legitimacy of national cultural institutions is a question? Could we see how many of you think it's a big issue? Okay, great. Thank you. Yes.
I think there is some confusion or about some basic terms here, because you are talking about public, yes, and you are talking also about state. And these terms, it's very important to make distinction, and also it's very important to see it in historical terms. I give you an example. You talk about Poland and about scene, avant-garde scene there, that was part of public institutions. No, it was the state, because in the communist regime, there was not really...
No, it's after. I'm talking about the period of 2000.
Sorry, I thought that you are referring to Mr. Gierek period when communist state actually supported a lot of alternative avant-garde practices.
No, it's about the 2004, 2016.
Okay, thank you. But still, I think it's really important to think about this distinction. For example, when you talk about synonyms for adjectives, national, you did not mention state. But state, that's how many people see the National Theatre, as the state institution. And for the National Gallery, that's the same story, because originally National Gallery was public institution, but then it was nationalized during Nazi occupation, and the communists just kept the same status of the institution. And I was in the institution, and we had a lot of debates about this, and it was not clear at all what is the distinction. So I think we should really think about this.
Can I have a comment? And when you say, that's interesting, when you say state institution, what do you see behind that? Or does it explain the meaning of the institution? Because I was trying to find synonym which say something, but when it's something state, what do you mean? Financed by state or run by state? In which way state?
All of the above. That's the thing that I mean, again, looking at this issue historically, and there is a lot of personal, individual, and collective memory, and that's the way people saw it during the communist period. Everything was run by the state. And so it was a long process, and it's still a process to understand what the public means in relation to the state. And it's not simple, clear-cut relationship or question. It's a complex one, but we have to address it.
There were other inputs. Yes, please, Goran. Yeah.
I'm Ivona Kreutzmanova from Tanec Praha NGO. And I would like to comment a little bit at the dance, in the National Dance Center in Romania. As far as I know Vava and I know what was created there, it's totally different in terminology and also in the conditions of creation of such a dance center. Because what we feel in this country as a national institution is what was mentioned: National Theatre, National Philharmony, Theatre Institute in Performing Arts, and then all of others in museums, galleries, etc. Library, of course. But these are very long-term based institutions, and there are about 19 in the whole country, as I remember. Maybe I'm wrong. Someone from Ministry of Culture knows. After this process of de-etatization, if I can call it this way, which means that really much more state institutions were given to the regions, as we heard this morning. And it's true that the public money are going to these regional institutions, repertory theaters all over the country. And with the knowledge of history, of development of these state and public institutions, I feel important to put a question: do we really need to stay on this model of repertory theaters in each region or statutory city? Do we need this system which is from last century? And is there a better model which we know from countries like Netherlands or France? Oh, France is not the best example, or others. Is there any way to change this disbalance between public institutions, state institution, and independent sector? This is my basic question. In Romania, as I know this dance center, it's different. They are not rich and big institution. They are waiting for the building, they are renting the space, and they have no money for staff. It's totally different from the situation of the National Theatre, for example.
So let's put it this way. They have the problem is that they do have money for staff because there was a raise of 50%. I'm sorry. I might know a little bit better. So the National Dance Center is not a repertory, for everybody who doesn't know, it's not a repertory institution. It doesn't have an artistic staff. It doesn't have a permanent company. And the only reason why it presents shows that it hosts or co-produces in a repertory system is that is because the whole system in Romania is repertorial, so audience doesn't come for project-based kind of presentations. The issue was exactly that the National Dance Center was an alternative model. It had the statute of legitimacy of a national institution, but it wasn't working as according to known models. And the problem is also that this model backfired because the state will always at some point try to tame at least its own institutions. So the main challenge that this kind of alternative institution, national institution, faces is that it has to enter on the institutional path on which its funding depends, but in the same time, it cannot work and it cannot retain its own rationale for working by trying to become a regular national institution, including because it will never have the kind of money that the National Performing Arts Institution in theater usually has. And the problem is less, it is also connected to money, but the main problem is this clash between the funding model of that institution that was totally atypical, at least for the context where it was founded, and the pressure and expectations that are put on it and on which its existence and funding depend. And it says a lot about, including about the fact that having public money and being a national institution doesn't give you an automatic legitimacy. Not in the eyes of the state, not in the eyes of the political, and not in the eyes of the audience or the artists. This is a constantly negotiating process. But this is above everything, the question of the space and struggling for production money and so on. This is the main issue and the main challenge for this institution. It is too atypical.
Thank you for telling it, because I feel that you are exactly touching this, what I was mentioning. Do we need only this old institutional model, which you described, or do we have really chance to find the way for atypical model like this dance house.
Well,
And develop it, because it needs the time to be developed. You cannot found in the country like Romania, dance house, like in Oslo in Norway.
well, it was, there was...
But there is the same history.
Maybe we should answer. Just to close it, because it's rhetorical. No, we cannot find it.
It's a practical.
We as person, we cannot find anything. So
We can.
No, we don't. This is a theoretical discussion, and actually, this is the example of a 12-year-old institution that was negotiated its own model of existence. It will go either way, but it's not. It doesn't depend on us here. That definitely, and it's a larger dynamic that I think is not in the power of anybody, including the person who's running now the center.
No, I'm not speaking about the person running the center, but I'm asking the question. In 10 or 12 years, you see some development which you describe like this is not functioning as a model. And I am asking the question, how can you come to the really good model of alternative way besides these institutions we are used to have if you don't give the time and money to someone who is trying to develop it? And that's why I'm giving the example from Oslo in Norway, because it was the same story. It was the dance community, the professional dancers who were pushing the state to really create a dance house as a national institution. And they are really 100% funded from the Ministry of Culture. And it works. And it works very well. And it's a good example. So I think it's also about the political situation and about the respect to different minorities in the artistic field. And contemporary dance, for sure, in our part of Europe, is a very, very small minority. So it's a question, building the audience for such an artistic field needs 20 years minimum. And it's still a dream, really, to get some large audience like repertory, drama, theater.
I'm feeling we are monopolizing the conversation on the National Dance Center, which is not exactly fair.
Maybe we will give the microphone to Goran.
Thanks. I also think it's really important not to get stuck in these a priori theories of what institutions are. I think it is really dependent on the history, on the context, and on the practices of a concrete institution. We did recently a research in Sarajevo. We talked with 12 directors and employees of 12, well, however you want to call them, public institutions. And we looked at how they legitimize themselves, who they feel responsible to in discursive ways, so through interviews, but then also through practices. What kind of consultations, selections, reviews, so on and so on, they have in the institution, which show in what way they feel responsible and legitimate. And we saw that actually because of the history and a specific context and so on, and this post-socialist time, they are not actually public institutions at all, most of them. They're not even state institutions, but party institutions. They're responsible and they respond and they evaluate their work in relation to really party members who are currently running the culture policy. Those directors that were more capable to explain and understand their own legitimacy in a more diverse way, so to say, yes, we are also democratic institutions, so we are responsible to our audiences. Yes, we are all responsible to our funders because we have private funders. Yes, we are all also responsible to the professional community because we are, I don't know, dancers or actors and so on. They were also more, they had more diverse funding streams, and they had more, well, I don't want to say autonomy because I think that's utopia, but they had more, let's say, loose network of interdependency. So they were more free to move around. And I really think that this, I mean, the legitimacy is really in the practice of the actual institution. And I like what Dieter said in the beginning, that he feels that he comes from a different world. And probably it's because you live in Germany. But, but I really think that it's really hard to have these theories across across nations and across.
I think you're fully right, Goran, on that point, that there are huge differences in between different countries, and I think what is really important, we should think what in general, all over Europe, is a common problem regarding national cultural institutions. I think there are several countries where we face the same situation, that national cultural institutions have a problem with the new challenges coming with a fast changing society, information society, with a digital shift who's coming up. So, and the political changes who are now very radical or fastly happening. And they have to face these challenges quite fastly also, but are not performing so well like competitors. The civil society organizations, the NGOs, are sometimes more creative, innovative, or quicker. And this is maybe also a point that should be questioned here. How does it come that this legitimacy is questioned here? It maybe comes from this competition, and where people see, why are they so slow? Why does it come? Due to public money? Due to the people, the person who are legitimated here? So that would be a common point that you should discuss maybe.
Thank you very much. So now we have the point that we can ask about why these institutions are slow. Yes, exactly. Yes, of course, I will give you a word. Yeah, you can go on. If this really...
I needed to respond, editor.
Yes, but if you can keep... I think that if you have some personal
sure.
things to
No, it's
tell
really
each other,
related
it's not,
related to
forum.
what is in the debate and so on. I don't... but first of all, I'm honored to be called a populist. I know also that that's the main populist intellectual statement that you can do. Blaming the other that he is a populist. That was I want to add also at the discussion this morning. But related to that, I think indeed there is, first of all, I think there is a mistake about just seeing money from the government and legitimacy one at one. I think there is a problem. Because first of all, and then I'm not a populist, it's not true what you say that they have a lot of money. Look at Europe, certainly south of Europe, national institutions have huge budget cuts, but also in Belgium, etc. That's one thing. But second thing is, and that's more important, I think, when they get indeed a lot of money, then the question is, what do they need to do with the money? And then you look also at the Netherlands, etc. There is a whole list of what those institutions had to do, which has nothing to do with art. And the last one who gets money is the artist himself. Or the less money, let's say it like that. And it's reduced and reduced. So we also have to look not only this legitimation one-to-one to money and national legitimation, there's also what are the obligations in this frame. Still to respond, because I feel Dieter is embracing somewhere the market, and I like that. I think it's interesting, but it gives certainly not more freedom. I think at the anecdote of Ai Weiwei, who was refused by Lego to get his Lego blocks because he was a political artist. That was a private company refused. So private companies are very aware when an artist becomes political, then it stops the freedom. So it's completely not democratic. That's for me a very important point. So it's an illusion to think that the private market gives you more freedom. But the last thing what Dieter said, and what I like very much, I think, is this open space. It's very interesting, I think, to think about a government who says, here's just open space, a building, etc., and we trust you that what comes out will be wonderful. And the last thing is, I don't see this much in a lot of countries, but that is a very important, I think, step to make a kind of open space as a government, as politicians, and say, okay, we trust you, what you do there, you can make it. And this, because this, at this moment we live, and that's why I also mentioned this maybe blunt populist statement of repressive liberalism, but that's what is happening. It's the politics of distrust, a management of distrust, which is going on now, and which really also under pressures a kind of artistic autonomous freedom in general. Until there.
Do you want to react on it?
Just briefly, I'm really glad there is a whole range of agreements between us. What I said, and this is the one thing, and I think you agree on that as well, wherever money comes from, is it public money, is it private money, wherever money comes from to support the art, it comes with strings attached, and that's a problem. It comes with strings attached, and thus, you know, I was focusing on national institutions, and I said, well, they have no problems because they accepted the strings and they get money, so be it. And then, if we open this to funding the art scene, then we have to see, once again, I repeat myself, it's a blessing and it's a danger to work with public money. And the suggestion that we open spaces and let's see what happens is, of course, I just want to mention this, is of course letting this bad market in, because all of a sudden people compete for the use of this space, and what do they compete for? For the recognition of the audience, which I think is not a bad thing in these spaces. And of course, spaces could be confined to certain forms of art, be this dance, be this jazz music, or be this something along the electric line that I don't like particularly, but then I don't need to go there. These spaces would be an improvement on funding the arts by taking out the pressure, by taking out a bit of the strings that are attached to this. And I think one could work out some models in having less strings, but if the public funds something, I think it is completely democratic. And there I disagree with you. It's completely democratic that the public attaches these strings to something, because finally it's the money that is taken out of the pockets of the people, you know, to take my populist side. So if the money is taken out of the pockets of the people, I think they should have a say. Is this going into a national theater institution? Is this going into heritage? Is this going into schools, or rather going into building streets or autobahns for that?
I feel that we talk too much about money. I'm sorry, because there's never enough money in the culture, of course, and there will never be enough money. And we keep talking about it for hours and hours. When I said that the National Theatre has a lot of money, I said it as somebody who worked on independent scene, and I know what it means not to have money. So compared with any other theatre, this is rich theatre. And from that, I think there's big responsibility. This is my main comment. And the second comment is, you started to talk about like legitimacy connected with the audience or with the critics or something. This is something what I would like to hear you more about, because, for instance, National Theatre has 3 venues. I mean, the drama department has 3 venues, which means 2,000 seats per night. You have to get 2,000 members of the audience per night. If you do boulevard comedies, I'm sure you will get 2,000 people, or you show TV stars. But this is the biggest conflict of the big institution, which have carried this terrible burden of huge buildings being built 150 years ago, as I said, mainly for opera, so mainly opera houses. And I think sooner or later these buildings will not serve for performance arts at all, at least for drama. Everything will I believe it will change. So maybe this is the moment when we will live like Wales. They have national theatre without the building as well. And then you talk about the concept of the institution rather than institution being connected with the building, which is the matter of, for instance, Czech National Theatre. But I think if we don't have enough money, but let's not talk about money anymore because, you know.
Why do you think it will change in such a way, and what kind of, I very much appreciate your emphasis of speaking about other, let's say, values than money. Would you be able to formulate what values are behind the mission of national cultural institutions nowadays, or maybe you can also use your case studies, of course.
This is why I came here, to learn.
To learn. Do you have something in mind?
What are the expectations? Like, I don't know. This is what I'm trying, this is why I worked, this is why I accepted the job in the National Theatre, to find out what should be or actually how to fulfill your idealistic dreams about addressing everybody, which is impossible.
Okay. So then addressing everybody to be an institution for, let's say, the majority of citizens is a value that keeps.
But at the same time, since I very often feel as a minority in various situations of my life, I think we should be able to address the minority as well, because, you know, the main thing you want to do is to do the art which addresses yourself. And to answer the other question, I think that the theater or performing arts will develop. If you look back at the theater, drama theater, 300 years ago, it looked completely different. It worked in different venues. And what's happening around these buildings, big, huge repertoire theater, the scene is so diverse. So I believe that sooner or later the classical approach to the theater as we know it will die out. Sooner or later. I don't know how soon.
Will it still be national, so to say, or public, or state-based?
I don't know. This is something I wish. I wish we could, the independent scene could develop and replace the big repertoire. But the biggest problem in this country, and I'm back to money, sorry, is if you close something, you don't reopen something new. You know, this process of transformation of something what has certain form into something else will take ages and ages. I believe it will transform somehow, but I don't think we could do it in a way that let's close this and let's open something else, because really in this country, if you close something in the culture, you don't reopen something else on the base of the previous institution. So maybe. And then we are probably getting to the term of state. When it's state institution, maybe the state will keep the institution as long as possible.
Yes. Is there some question that is related? Are you willing to speak?
So I think this is the principal question of the debate. If we have even nation, because if we have not more this national art, we have everything 200 years ago or 300 years ago. Still, what is the European culture? Is Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, and some others who are a little bit older or a little bit younger. So we have 2 centuries, or at least 150 years, that we don't have artists who could serve for all European nations. Huh? And the Czech National Theatre, I am a little bit older, so when I was younger, my school to go to National Theatre was Smetana, Dvořák, and Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is like my national figure because of his dramas. I have got the principle of humanity and of understanding of the other people. So that my question from the previous part. What is the national? I think we are in the period where we should say European, and inside of European we have diversified national traditions. But
Thank
I
you.
think
We
about
got your,
Smetana and
we
Dvořák.
got your question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very briefly, nations are constructions that have been made by the minds of people, by intellectuals discussing, by fighting wars, by doing all sorts of odd things. And with them come, of course, then cultural things, but they are not a given. They are something that has happened over history, and the same nations that exist might just disappear another time. So, I think we should be rather philosophical about nations and not look for the points where to keep them, but for the fluency of the whole concept. Thank you.
To the culture, which was universal, and it was, universities, they were based on the universal ideas of the European culture. So, what is the role of nation, and what is the role of national culture? That is the principal question.
I think you are being dramatic. People need food, shelter, love, maybe culture.
Not maybe, they need culture. They need culture.
Julia, is this nothing? You have opened the question of safety and shelter. I somehow picked up the proclamation of Goran, who said that the time is that we are living in some kind of time of transformation or perturbances in which we don't know who we are actually, and therefore we need some kind of safety. Do you think that, and this is a provocative question because we are permanently speaking about self-transformation and change, is there something like a role to provide some kind of security or stability or safety done or expected from national cultural institutions? I know that I can be very, yes. Some opinions?
To the audience or to the people working in them?
To the audience.
I think in principle there is no safety in human affairs. They may change, they may stay. Some safeguards may exist, and Goran, I take up what you said. Of course, from a German perspective, the world looks much more stable than from a Serbian or a Bosnian perspective. That's very clear. But still, societies come to different conclusions, and thus, for example, in terms of funding the arts, they take different distribution of public money and so on. And I think it's good that it works like this, because if things were stable, they would be boring. And I just remind you on something I said before, which is institutional conservatism. If the same people or the same institutions are funded all the time, then they get awfully boring. And I think the threat of, falling out of favor, or the threat of changing one's own behavior and so on to re-legitimize, for example, public funds that are addressed to something, is a good threat, because it keeps things alive and so on. So I don't think, and also, once again, there is no guarantee if you claim to be an artist. There's no guarantee that anybody is interested in that. You have to gain it by having someone who is interested in the kind of art you make. And either be this in the market or by public money or a combination thereof or whatever. But there is no safety in the long run. Maybe in Germany, but I doubt it.
So your question was whether us as institution should provide some security, or does the audience expect some security?
Well, security might be too provocative and extremist word for it, but my question was if the national institutions have a very old history, is there some value behind that that is about simply keeping going or maintaining some message, or let's say taking over and developing but in a continuous way, or providing a framework for experimentation, but not to go in all directions without any structure, for instance. But it's just a very open question that popped up when we were speaking here.
I think in a way it's a big controversy of the national institution, because if it's supposed to react to everyday's world, it has to experiment somehow, but at the same time the people coming to this institution expect something, and especially the National Theatre, there are people who come just once in their whole life to the National Theatre, and they expect to see something what they remember the world was like 20 or 30 years ago. And maybe this is the biggest conflict of, one of the biggest conflict of the national institution, your artistic vision of how to do things in a new way, or how to react to life, and at the same time the burden of protecting something or perceiving something. When we had a discussion about the National Theatre, I mentioned earlier, one of former directors of the National Theatre said that the National Theatre should protect the tradition. And we could not find, the people who were at the debate, we couldn't find the definition what the tradition is. Whether the tradition is what's happening now, or what happened when, like 20, when I was young or he was young, what the tradition is. And this,
15 years.
and this is something what actually is why we should ask constantly what the position and what the legitimacy of the national institution is, because it carries the burden of the tradition, and now we are in a circle, I think. Or maybe you have some answer?
Well, maybe I'm connecting it to the distinction between use values and exchange values. When I read your article, Pascal, you were speaking about some kind of taking care of home, let's say, of territory that is actually inhabited by people, that it's not only there in order to sell it in 1 month to someone else. And then the whole concept of identity in Europe is being renegotiated, but still the concept itself has a meaning, which means that we cannot be simply permanently beyond ourselves, so to say. This would be a psychedelic experience, and then maybe how to feel at home without being, how to feel with, how to feel some kind of intimacy in our lives, or enjoying the environment we are living in, without exclusion, without populism, without extremist thinking. Yeah.
I think Goran made a wonderful point on identity this morning in our discussion, saying that he doesn't know what he is. And I think this is the only way to rationally deal with the issue of identity, because if you look into it, if you look into the concept, every identity is an exclusion. It can't work otherwise. I would even go so far to say that if I'm finding an identity, I get it from outside and not from inside. I get it from the people who tell me, yes, you are what you claim to be, or worse, no, or yes, you are something that has to be oppressed, and we define who oppresses you. So I think identity is a very slippery concept. To feel well in identity is already going a step into the direction of populism, of this we are the people, which means others aren't. Well, it comes with it. If we are the people, others aren't. And I think the only way of constructing identity to make this a positive political program would be to allow people to get recognition of what they are as individuals, which means of what they as individuals contribute to whatever changing society they are living in. And this might be an artist thing, this might be a taxpayer, this might be love to a child or whatever, but this makes people so that they are still open and able to communicate. And I think the whole question of national identity, of course, it must come up if we talk about national institutions. The question of national identity is really dangerous. And maybe, you know, advanced societies might want to consider to give the mandate with the public money to their national institutions to rigorously question tradition, identity, and what we are. And then they are serving their societies best.
This might be a nice formulation of this new concept of identity. There are concepts of identity that are rigorously referring to self-alterity and self-opacity. So it's not only about this division between me and the other who is dangerous. Are there, yes, please.
I'm trying to align all these views in my head, and for me the debate is very much about how to constantly keep the margins and the marginal groups and the minorities of societies moving towards the center, or other way around, how to ensure that institutions that are already hegemonial institutes, because they are national institutes, how to keep them open to the marginalized in society. Because I want to refer to you, Göran, again, because I think I want to introduce to this debate here the word, the sense of belonging. And we have talked about identity, and we have talked about the need to be secure. For me, it is very much about a sense of belonging, and art is one of the strongest instruments of creating a sense of belonging, but also in meeting the people who are different from yourself, because they are fighting to be heard, and they are fighting to be visible, and by becoming heard and becoming visible to you as an outsider, you create a new sense of belonging. So maybe nation states are obsolete and obstacles, but communities are not. And within each nation state and across borders, there are communities. And they defy all traditional known boundaries. We have a feminist community, gay community, national minorities, whatever there is. But I think for me it's still about the dialogue and still about this movement from the marginalized position towards a platform where you are heard and made visible, and where a new sense of belonging is created. Because it is this human need to belong to other people or places or territory or in a language or wherever it is, that is being eroded by the marketplace, where things only have exchange value and or monetary value. That is what erodes our existence as truly human beings. So language is also another thing that I want to put into this equation, because we talk about nation states, but I think it's really about, very often it's about language and creation within a language. Because language is still, even though we have other kinds of arts, is still the most powerful tool of communication between one human being to another. So this was just a thought, because I haven't heard the words community or belonging, and the role of the national institutions in creating that belonging, as opposed to retaining a hegemonious position within society towards the more marginalized layers. Thank you.
Flexible, inclusive, and to really appreciate very much stability, and clearly say stability is not the same as static. We don't need static institutions, but we need stable institutions. Without stability, we cannot protect arts and culture as public good. So that's why I don't like this putting under the question legitimacy of institutions. It's better to say which kind of institutions we need and do whatever it requires to make them legitimate. They are really now the final anchor of the so-called welfare society. I would not say welfare state. So please stop the discussion with national identities and link this to national institutions. Let's shift towards communities and the need of communities for certain stability that can provide they also through institutions. And institutions in future should become, instead of structures, fixed, rigid structures, what we should do to transfer them to infrastructure.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I'd like to sort of support that point from a slightly different perspective. I come from a country where the most famous play in the country is called A Satire of the Three Estates. So as you'd expect, I'm rather attracted to the old-fashioned idea of a nation being composed of different estates. The estates being things like government, or the church, or society, or culture. And I think there is a big question about the balance of power between those different estates. And culture has to be aware of its place in that balance of power. So when institutions are bypassed, or when institutions stop operating into popular culture or having a big relevance, they're actually handing power, if you like, to the other estates, whether it's transnational corporations or government or whatever. And we see the consequences. I mean, I know in UK there's a good example when there was a lot of money put aside for a theme around the First World War over a number of years. And a lot of that didn't happen through the institutions. And it's had a very big effect on the culture of the UK, I would say, that kind of application of direct money by government into cultural events, not mediated as much through the big institutions as perhaps was normal. So I think for me, there is quite a big question of the power of the cultural estate, the role of the cultural estate, and not giving up populist culture to other bits of other estates. I think, you know, we all, no matter how big or traditionally or cultural institution is, there is a responsibility to operate into the more populist cultural space as well.
Thank you a lot. We have approximately 10 minutes to finish the discussion. Julia asked several times to say something. No.
I wanted to say that I do have here belonging and community, because that's what I was thinking from my perspective, coming from performing arts, when the discussion turned towards the University of Culture and so on. Actually, performing arts are extremely local, because they are so linked, especially theater, because they are so linked to language. They actually serve a community that is giving these arts, theater, a reason to exist. It exists for that local community. You can call it nation, you can call it a block of flats. And I think this culture is as important as public mass education for exactly the same reasons, because it raises a feeling of belonging to this larger community, call it as you wish, because it serves to share common values and to construct common values, from tolerance to even to heritage and sharing a history and everything else. And I do think that national institutions are under pressure in trying to prove their legitimacy, because the idea that they are legitimate just because they exist doesn't work in relation to exactly the community that they are supposed to serve. And this is the challenge, actually, for them themselves to question their legitimacy and to actually take into consideration this role that they have in terms of building a community, a larger or smaller community. And this is the most important thing, including in terms of the artistic community. The Romanian public and state theater and national theaters in Romania are under huge pressure to become more flexible in terms of labor and social protection. No, the rest of the theater has to offer more protection, social protection, labor protection, better pay, following the model of the public institutions. This is actually in my part of the world the biggest issue. How to actually help national institutions and public institutions, but mainly national institutions, fall under their own unavailability or incapacity to question their legitimacy on one hand, and their own way of functioning with the good parts of how they function. Because we can with the National Dance Center, yes, it's a wonderful alternative institution, but it took from the independent scene the precarity of the artists that a similar performing arts national institution would never have. How can you build this kind of institutions that can be in the same time as strongly or welfare oriented as the actual nowadays institutions, and as willing to adapt and to become more socially involved as the others?
Are there some other questions or comments from the audience?
Flexibility is not about more or less social security.
No, I did understand. I just wanted to take your word and use it in this context.
I would like to explain it. Flexibility is about mission-serving institutions, so that those people should have opportunity to be engaged by institutions that are needed in relation to the mission, to the program, and not in relation to social rights. So cultural institutions should be mission-driven institutions.
I would like to ask our three speakers maybe to say some kind of final words, especially if you can say that, did you discover something through this discussion? Did you understand there is some hot point that is important to be mentioned again? Do you want to grasp something more precisely from what we have said until now?
I like the part of the discussion that ventured into flexibility, community, and so on. And I think we had several discussions both in the audience and on the podium, so I stick to this one point. I think, yes, community is very important, but only if it's fluent. Communities can close as well, and that doesn't make them any better than nation states or other forms of identity because they are exclusive. Secondly, I think we shouldn't only look at the minorities, but we should also look at the people who are in the middle of society, because if we lose them, we might be in trouble. Third, just a short point, I think we shouldn't beat on markets all the time, or if we do so, we should at least keep the standards of the discussions of political economy. It's complete nonsense that markets are only about exchange value. In the end, we need to use the things and consume them for whatever strange reasons. You know, I don't understand most reasons to consume things, but this is just my personal thing. So let's just keep our concepts straight. Markets are not about exchange values. Markets are about providing things to people so they can live. And if there are other forms of provision, fine. But we still have the problem that resources in societies are limited, and we have to find ways on how to deal with them. And I think the economy of culture is just one part of this debate. Let's keep it clear and not use bad concepts. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Do you want to?
No, I did it before.
Okay. Marta? If you don't like to say anything, so maybe you smile on us. And thank you very much for your engagement, for your ideas. Thank you very much to all three of yours for your inputs and very important opinions. And I hope that we gathered anyway fruitful discussion over this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is the end of the conference, and I would like to thank to all speakers. It was a very motivating debate. I hope this is just the end of the debate. We will definitely continue in all countries of Compendium. And because in the same time is the end of 16th Assembly of Compendium Authors, I would like to give the last word to Andreas Wiesand.
Thanks a lot. You were clapping at me a while ago. You should have clapped at yourself, because actually, and I think I made that clear at the beginning, there are others to thank, and the most to thank is that this community actually has survived for so long and is fruitful. There is a motto here written on this podium: truth, if I have it properly in mind, truth and love will overcome lies and hatred. And that means we need to also consider, and especially in a case where we discuss national institutions, that this exchange between nations and countries and different expert communities is so important, and I'm happy that the Compendium can and hopefully will in the future contribute to that. Thank you very much.